So there's this very holistic evolutionary selection process, which isn't natural selection, which is much broader. Eventually, that process produced the human. The human eventually turns around and now is poised to destroy life. Right? What the hell is that?
Zak, thank you for being on the show again. It's a pleasure to have you.
Yeah, happy to be back. Good to see you again.
So 2 months ago, the Consilience Project published a paper about our current idea of progress. And one of its statements is that our idea of progress is actually immature in the first place. Why did you wrote this paper?
Yeah, so the Consilience Project is an attempt to make possible certain conversations in the public about the future of civilization. And it began with work in sense making, which is to say, the fourth estate, as it used to be called, or the media, or even the academy, the thing that's supposed to be kind of like the brains of civilization, is dysfunctioning. There's a sense making crisis. And then related to that, there's a notion of a meta crisis, which is the idea that the entire planet is embroiled in catastrophic and existential risks like never before. And they're cascading into one another, and they're based on these deeper generative dynamics. So we're proposing that the civilization is in crisis. Of course, that narrative is different from a narrative which would be like a progress narrative, like a Steven Pinker narrative, or a Mark Andreessen narrative, which would be a roughly techno-optimistic narrative, which is a narrative that progress has occurred. So we're saying like the civilization is about to self-terminate. At the same time, other people are saying like the civilization is better than it has ever been in the hundreds of thousands of years that humans have been alive. So those are maximally different claims about the current situation. So the heart of that is this question of progress, and what does it mean for a civilization to not just change, but for a civilization to get better? And what would that even mean? And so there's a bunch of deep questions in that, and many of them are just empirical questions about what is the actual state of things. Like, have things been getting better? What's the evidence for that? So that paper was written in that context of kind of like trying to kind of like lay the groundwork for a different kind of conversation about civilization itself. And much of Western civilization has been guided by a narrative of progress. And so we're kind of like trying to get to the heart of the matter.
Yeah. And so in your paper, you say that our current idea of progress is naive. Maybe can you expand on that, and why do you call it naive?
So one way to think about naivete is to think about something that is well-meaning but not completely informed about what the full consequences of their situation are. So like children often we perceive as appropriately naive. And what that means is that the child is trying to do the right thing, but they're not complex enough, they're not deliberate enough, they're not experienced enough to be not naive about, whether they could become president or something like that. Right? So like little kids think things like, oh, that's very cute, you're naive. So similarly, although in a much, much, much more complex way, our notions of progress have been naive because they've been well-intentioned, but just not factoring the second, third order effects of what it really means to do that kind of thing. And so the measurement of progress according to narrow metrics, which are optimized at the expense of holistic consideration is a more formal way to define what we mean by naive, which is just that, oh, you think your company is doing well because it is making profit. Huh. It seems like there's a broader definition of well that we could use, which would be like something like, is it benefiting the world? Or like, forgive that sounds naive, right? But in fact, it's more naive to believe something so simplistic as a single quantitative measure is useful for setting the cybernetic feedbacks of, quote, improvement for an entire large organization, right? So it's a complex thing I said, but it basically means like your definition of progress sets you up in a position to measure whether you're doing it or not, and then improve your operations to do it. And so measurement enabled kind of efficiency optimization is one way to think about naive progress also. So it's like totally you've maximized efficiency at doing something, but you haven't asked the question of whether that thing is worth doing. So Donald Hebb spoke about, he was a great neuroscientist, psychologist. He said, something not worth doing is certainly not worth doing well. And so that's that question of naivete and maturity, which is not in the execution of means, but in the selection of ends, if I can put it that way. So that's getting a little bit formal and philosophical. Yeah, so I'm curious if that was sufficient. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. And maybe we can pick some of the broad topics that you take in your paper to show examples of progress narrative applied to big human phenomena and big human trends. One of the topics is violence, and about that, Steven Pinker wrote a book a couple of years ago, which is called The Better Angels of Our Nature. And in this book, he makes a pretty compelling story about the decline of violence in our societies through history. Maybe you can talk about that. Is this representation that violence is declining in our society, is it misleading?
Yes, it is misleading for varieties of reasons. So I won't get into the actual statistics that Pinker would marshal to bring this up, but there are very real questions about the statistics themselves, but I'm not going to get into that. There's actually places, I can give you some links later to people who've looked at that. But in a sense, it's definitional. In a sense, it's definitional because if by violence you mean something very specific, which is kind of like, being subject to the outcome of large-scale power conflict, right? So like Pinker's claim is something like the people dying in war has gone down. And I think there's also an argument that there's a general kind of like increase of civility, meaning like lesser widespread domestic violence and things of that nature. So as I said, you can question those statistics, which is to say like there's millions and millions and millions of men in prison in the United States. Many of them. So the question of like, is keeping men in prison doing violence? So this is what I mean by that definition. So there's like, okay, classic violence, like people shooting people because they're told to do so by presidents and emperors. But then there's this other question of like, okay, so in my life I haven't experienced large scale war. You live in France, right? So you also haven't. You're closer to one that's occurring now than I am. But in a sense, there's that sense of, we don't know war. But if you look at policing in the United States, and again, the mass incarceration that occurs in the United States at levels completely unprecedented in history. You're looking at the ubiquitous presence of capacity for violence, ubiquitous presence of radical asymmetric capacity for violence exists in a way that it never did before. So that's a fancy way of saying, like, it is no longer the case that if we grab the pitchforks, we could like get the bad guys, right? So you're in France, right? So you had this whole French Revolution thing that depended upon symmetry of violence capacity between the people in the streets and the people in Versailles, meaning the most sophisticated means of perpetuating violence were accessible to everybody. Carol Quigley, who was a historian of civilization, had a basic idea that the only time you get something like democracy is when you have that type of symmetry. If what Pinker was saying was true, we would live in a very strange world where the ubiquitous presence of radical asymmetric violence capacity, which means like the United States military versus its own citizens. Citizens lose like fast. Now, militias and stuff think that they have a chance, but it's because they actually, for psychological reasons, refuse to understand the actual asymmetry there. So Pinker's not factoring like, oh, we actually live in the presence of forces of violence that cannot be resisted in a way that's historically unprecedented. So it's a very important increase in events. We also live in the presence of existential weaponry, which he doesn't mention. But never before in history did all people live in the shadow of nuclear war. So again, to me, not factoring potential violence in the equation of has violence waxed or waned is super weird. So it's like, imagine you're in a situation where there's a lot of violence because this guy did a lot of violence and he hasn't done a lot of violence for a while, but he's been working out and studying martial arts and that kind of stuff. And you're like, oh, there's less violence. Yeah, but have you noticed the guy's been working out and studying martial arts? There's more potential for violence and a completely irresistible asymmetric violence. How can you tell me that you should feel safe because there's less violence, right? So it's a strange argument. And then the deeper argument is just that Pinker's obviously not studied war. I'm sure he studied like histories of war stuff, but he hasn't studied theory of warfare. And so those who do know that after World War II, we went into what's called fourth and fifth generational warfare. Fourth and fifth generational warfare does not involve kinetic violence in the same way, but it involves very profound psychological and cultural violence. So this is information warfare, which merges into neuro warfare, which is now the predominant front in a very widespread conflict that's planetary at this point. The front is everywhere and it's on your screen. So that's another issue that Pinker's just not tracking. The ubiquity of fourth and fifth generational warfare, which is about degrading the morale and capacity of your enemies by any means necessary, as long as it's plausibly deniable and doesn't involve escalating kinetic violence, right? So right now we know that the precursors for phenol, which is a very dangerous drug that is sweeping through the United States and completely incapacitating millions of people. It's a profound humanitarian crisis. The precursors for that drug are being brought across the border with some plausibly deniable combination of nation-state rivals to the United States and organized crime. Okay. So now, does Pinker track that as violence? Nope. What is that? He's probably not even really thinking about that, or he'd think like only Trump supporters say something like that because he's in the academy. But in fact, it's a very, very real issue that fourth and fifth generation warfare does not look like war, and precisely makes you think you are not at war when you are being systematically degraded and demoralized and prepared to be eventually overcome. So to me, that again is another very complex thing. And then if you look at increase in assassination as a political tool, also increasing. So I think there's, again, the reason why people make arguments that things are getting better is because in some domains, on some measures, things are getting better. And then another reason people make those arguments is because there's very strong psychological and even cultural reasons to want to make those arguments. Because it's very hard to live in a mind that's convinced that the world is getting worse, and it's very hard to live in a culture that's convinced that the world is getting worse. So you can't simply tell a doomer story, but you do have to tell a realistic story about where we are. And where we are is in a position of both tremendous potential violence and ongoing ubiquitous manipulative information war. This was what the Consilience papers did in their first pass. Those propaganda papers kind of get to this point. So violence, I believe, is an interesting example where there was both kind of a fudging of the statistics and an ignoring of a whole range of phenomena not included in the statistics, and then a kind of motivated reason bias to want to not see how horrendous and like how horrendously worse our capacities for violence are, and how horrendously worse the actually occurring violence on the planet now it is. Like so it's weird to it's you know, I don't want to get into too much about why the motivating reasoning would have people tend to make these arguments. There's of course also motivated reasoning for doomers, but that's another conversation. So I'm curious how that landed.
Si tu apprécies cette chaîne, pense à t'abonner et à activer la cloche. N'hésite pas à donner de la visibilité à cette vidéo en la likant, en la partageant ou en la commentant. La Fabrique Sociale est un média indépendant et a grand besoin de soutien financier. Si tu en as les moyens, n'hésite pas à faire un don sur ma page Tipeee. Même les petits gestes sont très importants pour la survie de cette chaîne.
Well, you talk about information warfare, and I think there's a big link between this and the erosion of the education system. And I work in an organization in France where I work with kids, with children that are actually addicted to their screens, and you can see the psychological damage that it does to their brain. And you can have very weird conversations with them because you're not so much older than them, but they live in a completely different world, and that's very striking. And I think that's a good transition for my next question and the next topic I wanted to bring about education. Is there also a naive progress narrative that fails to recognize the limitations of our current education system?
Oh, absolutely. 100%. It's a great question, actually. And it's in the progress narrative. Education is one of those ones. And I'd love to just talk to you about your work. Actually, it's a question that is of great interest to me. The phenomenon, like the experience of the youth with regards to these technologies, like aware that they're living in brains that have been broken by screens and not sure what to do about it. So I'd love to talk about that. And that's an example where it's like, I'm not going to go there. I already did the information war piece, but to your point, let's see, what's the best way into this? So there was a time when what became known as the large-scale public education systems in the nation states, kind of post-Westphalian, was truly educational progress. Like there are cases where there has been mature progress, and we have to note like there's been mature progress. So like I've told this whole story about Comenius, John Amos Comenius, and the invisible college and the transition out of the feudal system into this thing we call modernity. And at that time, it was a situation where school was for a small number of people. And when you went there, you learned obscure Latin for theological purposes and were beaten mercilessly, like as part of the training, sometimes including castration and other things because it was religious training, and it was not. And most people didn't go, and women, of course, never went. And they weren't taught to read in their own language. They weren't taught anything that would empower them. They were taught things that would basically yoke them to the church and to the feudal ideology. Comenius, after getting the shit beat out of him in school, was basically like, that's horrible, and started to proselytize a very radical new form of education in which everyone would be educated to the max of their ability. And he meant everyone at a time when like that was a crazy thing to say. He meant everyone the way we mean everyone, more or less. Now, he was a Christian, so he wanted to, in a sense, bring everyone into a universal truth that he thought he was proximate to. But when you read his language carefully, he means everyone, including everyone in all the different religions. And he was an early proponent of the perennial philosophy. But at that time, moving out of the feudal educational system into this kind of nascent modern education system was kind of remarkable. Now, it was then eventually co-opted by the nation state, and many of Comenius's most important ideas were jettisoned. So, for example, it took a long time to have equal access to education, even though Comenius said it in the late 1500s, right? And so that's an example where it's like, wow, yeah, okay, that was crazy. The printing press comes along, it starts to reshape everything. We need a fundamentally new type of thing. Comenius drops some crazy wisdom. People pick it up. We get this sense of what we now think of as the inclusiveness of an educational system that is kind of like the most caring part of a nation state, right? You think like they would want you to think, right? They would want you to think like the schools and the healthcare. So these are the places where the society like cares for people. That's a notion that we kind of get from that era of Comenius. It's no longer the church, right? It's no longer the family. There's something that like this larger entity provides for all the children, and they grow. And specifically, we don't teach them dogma. We teach them science, math, self-reflection, and the conditions that make democracy possible. So there's a time when that blossomed, and then there was this kind of remarkable increase in certain forms of knowledge and access to certain forms of knowledge. But one of the main things you see in the study of civilizations is this kind of like these cycles of dynamics within the civilization of kind of maturation, and then kind of like calcification, and then kind of like breaking and decay, and then a reconfiguration. And there's these rhythms. Most classic ones being the kind of generational ones of Strauss and Howe, but there are other ones. And Joseph Tainter, who studied this since ancient Mesopotamia all the way through the Comenius 30 years war period up to the world wars and stuff, you get a pattern of institutional decay. You get a pattern where forms that used to work no longer work. But it takes a very long time to recognize that. And in the meantime, it starts to break a bunch of stuff. And so that is what the situation is now. And so to your point, these things have eventually became, especially in the lead up to the world wars, and then through them, and then after, those massive school systems got turned into some of the most the most effective large-scale human domestication systems ever created. So then our happy words about education, which were true for a long time, like desegregation, kind of moving this whole thing forward, eventually that story starts to catch up with us, and we can't talk ourselves out of it, and we can't see that the schools are no longer working. And so under those conditions, then the schools become a functionary of the economy, or the schools become a functionary of the political polarization, meaning that the schools don't have their own resistance to the larger forces of the civilization. So that means, why do you go to school? To be trained to be a worker. Why do you go to school? To be indoctrinated into this political view. And so you have that sense of the championing of more and more education, and the having education is the kind of last bastion of our hopes to realize democracy. At the same time, education is becoming more and more the opposite of what it needs to be. And so therefore the progress narrative again is naive. They think because more kids can read and do well on standardized tests that the education is better. But when you look at countries that do the best at the educational tests and the standardized tests, like South Korea, the leading cause of death in South Korea is suicide. And it's mostly among the youth. So again, narrow metric optimization, standardized tests improving equals quality education is just obviously incorrect. But we started to use that measure more and more as the schools got worse and worse, right? So yeah, and of course, I'm speaking a little bit from the American context, because I know in different countries things do work differently. But yeah, so yes, we've made educational progress in the long arc of history in many ways. That's true. But in other ways, what was lost as the large scale kind of like public schools began to calcify, what was lost began to catch up with us. So like, for example, were our ancestors better or worse at moral education than us? Very complex question. Very complex situation, right? If you're a moral relativist, you'd say we're better, but that would be a weird thing to say because you're a moral relativist. That would be the only response, because we're really good at teaching young people that every ethical framework is basically as good as every other. We're pretty good at doing that. And then smuggling in some very strong preferences, which go unstated about how people ought to be. But that's very different from having a coherent ethical culture into which people are socialized into a self-understanding that's coherent with themselves and reality and others. That would be like moral education, not indoctrinating people to beliefs. That's what the relativists make you think moral education has always been. It's different. It's actually socialization into a non-arbitrary social space where there is coherent, reasonable conversation, what is desirable and undesirable, good and bad about people's identities and actions. So are we better at doing that or worse than doing that than our ancestors? Are we better at teaching people science and engineering? Yes. Easy question, right? So that gets to this point about have we made progress in education? If you're asking, have we made progress in teaching people math, science, and engineering? Yes. In many ways, yes, almost predominantly. But these other, have we made better artists? Have we made better ethical leaders? Have we made better parents? Have we made better stewards of the environment for the future? Right? All things that education should be accomplishing, clearly is not accomplishing. So yeah, so naive progress would have us raise our, voices with success because we've focused on a narrow little metric and moved that thing along. Like education means teaching people to do math and science and join the economy. We were succeeding at that kind of, although not as good as we used to do even at that. But you ignore all of this other stuff. You ignore all of this other stuff. Selectively do not attend to all of the other reasonable ways you could be considering the value of the outcome of your actions.
And in your paper, you talk about the difference between content-based education and context-based education. And I don't think that's a difference that many people see or are aware of. Maybe you could expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, so content-based is what most people come to think of education as, which is that you've been educated when you come away with a certain collection of ideas about the world, about science, about politics, about your own mind, and about history and that kind of stuff. So it's content, boom, boom, boom. Like these dates, your country started in this time, and there were these leaders and that kind of stuff in history. In math, you get multiplication, you get division, you get, right, and then science, you get earth science, and you get physics, and right, so you're like all that content, right? But all that's taking place in a context. And this is sometimes talked about as the hidden curriculum. And this is what I mentioned, where the explicit curriculum is moral relativism, let's say, but the hidden curriculum is actually a preference for a certain type of inclusiveness, which they don't put on the table as up for debate. So similarly, like, it's not up for debate if you sit in desks or not. It's not up for debate if you eat shitty cafeteria food. It's not up for debate when the school starts. It's not up for debate how long the periods are, what teacher you have, what subjects you are taught, how you are assessed. So the hidden curriculum is very different, and it teaches a whole bunch of lessons about how humans work and how institutions work and how the world works. Even simple stuff like, do we pay attention to our things we put in our body and where our waste goes? Many schools don't pay attention to that. And then the idea of the bureaucratically mandated teacherly authority as the predominant context in which you experience teacherly authority is something I speak about a lot, which is basically that's a context thing. So the teacher gives you content, but the teacher is in a context, right? If I'm talking to somebody who I've never really met and I find out that and I get to know them and I'm like, wow, you're super informed about something, and I start asking them questions, the context is very different for my learning. It's a legitimate, organic, emergent teacherly authority. It's one of those beautiful things if you enjoy learning. Very different from sitting with someone who's giving you content because you're legally mandated to be there. They're getting paid to be there. There's not an obvious asymmetry. There's not an obvious curiosity, meaning there's not an obvious sense that they actually know more about you or know more about the world. So that's the context of schooling. It is bureaucratically mandated teacherly authority, not organically emergent teacherly authority as a result of mutually perceived knowledge and skill asymmetry, which is what we want from teachers. We're like, wow, you are better at that than me. I want to know that. I will hang out around you and learn that. Whereas in school, it's like, I don't even know if I want to learn this. I don't even know if you're really that smart. You're getting paid. I have to be here. I can't not be here. So that's part of that context. It's like, condition yourself to put up with bullshit. Condition yourself to not fully understand how the institutions work. Condition yourself to have a lot of your day be not under your discretion. Condition yourself to go to the bathroom when you're allowed to get up from bed when they tell you, to work on tasks that benefit nothing but your own self-advancement, and so on. None of that's said, because you can't say it. And there's a whole bunch of other stuff loaded into the hidden curriculum that's much worse, which is harder to speak about. So that's the context content thing. So in some sense, yeah, we've made progress in content. In many domains, we know more about the world than ever, and therefore can deliver content about the world to kids. But the contexts have not improved, and you could argue that the contexts have gotten worse. And this is back to my point about, are we socializing better than we have? Even if we were kind of training in specialties better than we ever have, we are not socializing better, would be my claim. But again, that gets to this question of value realism, which is first philosophy around what it means to think about what's better and worse, especially with regards to humans. And that's, again, we'll avoid that. Not us, but in education, especially people who are concerned about the operational efficiency of education according to narrow metrics. That question should not be asked. That's a taboo question. It opens up too many. What does it really mean to have someone well educated? Yeah. Is passing this test really mean they're well educated? Come on, you can't really look at me and say that seriously. So what does it really mean? And by that larger thing, are we succeeding and failing? That's just maturity, really looking at what you're doing with your behavior.
Yeah, and you talked about the fact that we produce a lot of knowledge, and there's never been more knowledge accessible in our society. And it seems to me, when I talk with people, that one of the big problems in their personal lives is how to manage all this information.
So if you look at bioinformatics and semiotics and stuff, to an organism, information is stress, basically. Like if things are going well, the information throughput is smooth. This is what Piaget would call assimilation. Right? Piaget, the psychologist, right? So it's like the organisms in the information exchange with the environment. There's a symmetry, but you don't feel, there's no discomfort. There's not stress. It doesn't even show up as kind of information. But as soon as you start to get that overload and you have to accommodate, which means change your processing, the information becomes stress. And so most of what we think of as information is actually stress, because like, if you're sitting in your house in a chair that you know, surrounded by your things, you're getting infinite amount of information through your nervous system. You're just not reading it as information because it's just going through you, right? But as soon as you open up your phone, now all of a sudden it's all of this stuff you have to factor. Right? So that's the first lesson, which is like, there's an infinite amount of information present in your non-mediated experience of the world, full stop. Which means like, if you're bored, that is your problem. So the idea that we're like info-seeking people, yeah, but we're also totally addictable and distractible. So the main thing to think about if you have an information overwhelm problem is, what do you do, quote, in the absence of information? Which is actually a question about how do you make your everyday experience rich with information? This is why meditation and other spiritual practices are important. So that's the first thing. It's like, and if you're not willing to do that, then you can't really complain about this other thing, because you don't know what it's like to not have that other thing. Because people used to not have that. So when we were info hunting, by evolutionary design, what we were doing, we weren't reading the newspaper, man. You know, we were looking at plants. We were looking at the clouds. We were thinking about what someone said. We were smelling the air, looking to think about a storm, right? So we were getting all of this information. And in fact, arguably probably more information than you or I could get if we went out and chilled out in that same natural spot and tried to just like soak it all in, right? So I'm saying the first step is to kind of like run interference on that pattern of information seeking and start to find the presence of that infinite availability of information in everyday experience. Then from there, go to this thing that you hold in your hand, which you think is full of important information. And then think, where am I getting my information? If you're getting it from a social media feed, then it is very likely that you don't want or need the vast majority of what you're looking at. So that's right. So is your seeking of information endogenous to your own psychology? Or is your seeking of information basically the result of advertising? So similar to any question about why am I doing this? Is it me doing this, or am I doing this because I was told or conditioned to do this? So that's the next step. So what I'm trying to point to is like artificial information overload, which is not yours to hold, which is the result of being in this culture. Once you've gotten to that, then there's the information overwhelm that is yours to hold because it's your unique learning path through all of this available information. So like, I'm a psychologist, philosopher, study X risk. More books than I could ever possibly read. So and more articles coming out every day about all these X risk topics and advances in psychoanalytical diagnostics and all of this stuff. And so that's when I think information overwhelmed, that's appropriate. That's what it is. That your unique information, kind of like a transformer role, like you're the unique conduit of all of this book. But I don't feel overwhelmed by my social media. I don't have a social media feed, right? I don't feel overwhelmed by keeping up with TV shows or celebrity news or protest cultures or propaganda campaigns from mainstream media. I can track most of what's occurring in the culture in about 10 minutes a day of scanning headlines and stuff. Every once in a while, there'd be much deeper stuff, which I'll get into, but it's connected to this information overwhelm that is mine to hold. So that's like one answer. It's like totally, but be overwhelmed by information about the right things, and don't be in the overwhelm of information that everyone is in, which is, you know, basically part of that domestication and kind of like pacifying and manipulating that is now, you know, pretty common. So yeah, don't get out of that and into one that is more appropriate, and that's different, but none of that is possible if you can't just sit without information for as long as you want. Like for many people, that's almost impossible. So it's like, work on that. Otherwise, you'll just seek it because you have to.
Yeah. And to go back to this naive progress narrative that fails to recognize the externalities that are produced in the pursuit of progress. One of its features is that it shows a lack of connection. What do you think is at the root of this disconnection?
Yeah, so a couple of things I'll say. So evolution for billions of years was innovating in the creation of forms that created more life, right? So there's this very holistic evolutionary selection process, which isn't natural selection, which is much broader, which kept allowing for the emergence of things that were net generative to the rest of life. Eventually, that process produced the human. The human eventually turns around and now is poised to destroy life. Right? What the hell is that? Super weird, actually. If you think about it, if you just linger on that, right? That there's an evolutionary metastability in the physiosphere and biosphere, meaning that there's a bunch of stuff going on, but the overall thing equilibrates. That's why we had what we now know of as the ecosphere for billions of years on the Earth. You know, dinosaurs, all this crazy stuff happening, but never did the whole thing self-terminate as a result of an emergent until the human. So what is that? How do you explain that? One thing we have to think about is the absence of metastability at the level of human culture and technology, meaning that we can totally get in cul-de-sacs that self-terminate for some reason at this level that we couldn't at prior levels. And it's not that there weren't extinctions, there were, and many of them were exogenous, meaning, you know, meteorites and things of that nature. But we have technologies that are literally biocidal, meaning they are destructive to biology. So for example, like most of the most dangerous elements were sequestered in the earth, in rock and stuff. And then we went and mined them out and crushed them into powder and put them into the atmosphere. And they're bad for everything that's biological, full stop. There was no way for that stuff to be released from the earth, except for like rare volcanic explosions, except through the activity of this strange creature that mined out of the earth things that were toxic to life at a scale that then started to destroy life. And I'm not even talking about like climate change. I'm talking about like just like mining pollution, which released elements into the air like lead, which just would not have been there. And lead dropped human IQ and a whole bunch of stuff over, right? So there's this whole story. So that's the question of how the heck did this thing get off course? But now once I've said off course, now I've just said that there is an on course. And now we're in a complex conversation about the universe, which most modern people do not want to have. So one of the reasons we're off course is what I just said, which is that we don't believe that there is a course to be on. Again, a unique problem for our civilization that has to be resolved. But to get directly to the point, at every level of evolution, you get novel emergence. And with the novel emergence, new capacities emerge. The human is unique in several ways that allowed for a new type of domain of evolution to occur. And this was cultural evolution. Technology specifically. So let's step back. So tiger and a gazelle in an ecosystem, right? Tiger gets faster, bigger claws, kills more gazelles. The gazelles who are left were faster, smarter. They have babies. So gazelles get faster. So evolutionary time, you don't get this massive asymmetry where all of a sudden a tiger emerges that can kill all the gazelles in one season. Humans come. We don't have teeth and claws like that. So we make stone tools, right? That's cool. Then we start to intergenerationally transmit improvements on the stone tools over decades. This creates the possibility for a non-holistic asymmetry to emerge in the evolved environment, meaning that technology, not just the emergence of a simple technology, like, monkeys use sticks and stuff to kill monkeys and prey, but the emergence of the ability to intergenerationally transmit ratcheted improvement upon those technologies and the accompanying practices around them. So then you start to get the possibility for humans to have tools that do allow for us to radically alter whole ecosystems in a single season. And you start to get evidence of what's called a soft Anthropocene in thousands of years BC, which is evidence of large-scale controlled burning for easing of hunting, and the argument that it was us who extincted the megafauna, post-ice age megafauna. And so that's that story. How did it get started? It got started with our ability to intergenerationally transmit tech-based culture changes that then augmented the natural symmetries that evolved in a metastability over time in the ecosphere. And now we have a non-metastabilized cultural evolutionary process, which means we have to somehow, in the process of intergenerational transmission, consciously instantiate the holistic selection mechanisms that allowed for metastability at the ecological level. So it's like a huge mouthful, but it basically means like mature progress, slow, factoring everything, factoring balances of power, factoring symmetries, factoring synergistic satisfiers and metabolic closure and a whole bunch of other things. So we're looking for biophilic, meaning rather than biocidal evolutions of technology and civilization, which would get us back, quote, on track, which means at the very simplest level, out of a non-metastable cul-de-sac of self-termination and into some metastable evolution that allows for the physiosphere, ecosphere, cultural sphere to be in alignment, which means not self-terminating, which is the minimal viable success there in a sense. So that's a very long answer to your question, which is it's about this technology and this weird thing that humans do, which is long duration joint attention during years of childhood. So if it wasn't for our because we walked upright, having to leave the womb early, having to be raised outside the womb for an extremely long time compared to other mammals, and therefore in, quote, conversation about stuff for a very long time to even get up and into what it means to be a mature member of the species, that novelty of intergenerational transmission coupled to the improvement in technology made it so that you get the biblical stories about how, and other stories in other cultures, where at a certain point we started to tell myths like, oh, we're kind of in control of the animals. Oh, we kind of have to be responsible for the earth. Like we go from being a part of nature to somehow supervening on it and having to choose with it and for it. And we're just still trying to learn that, and it's not clear that we're going to like do that in time. So that uniqueness of the human is what I'm pointing to as that thing. Now, of course, there's also continuities with prior evolution. This gets to the work of David J. Temple, what I've been doing with Mark Gaffney and Ken Wilber, but that sense of, yeah, there's a discontinuity between the human and the rest of nature. And yet, in order for us to survive, we need to biophilically realign with the first principles and first values of cosmic evolution. That's a kind of almost a religious way, and maybe a not palatable way to what I had said previously, which is that learn from what the principles were that enabled for metastability of biological and ecological evolution for years meaning millions, thousands, maybe billions. Learn from those principles and not design based on those principles, but design in cultural evolution principles that would be loving of, right, merging with, erotically intimate with those biological precursors. So it's a complex ask, because civilization so far has been predicated upon being mostly biocidal, except in the context when it went to being oriented around the preservation of the commons. But usually those periods have been periods that we call dark ages. So that's a deeper conversation of what period are we in, where are we moving to, what are the changes in the value regime, meaning like we can no longer live in a civilization that believes there is no such thing as on course or off course in a fundamental sense. And that's back to this work on first principles and first values, which is fundamentally about those most basic questions as to what a civilization ought to be built in the interest of.
Yeah, and to bounce back on what you said about information technology and the writing world that enabled our species to accumulate knowledge and transmit it. I think there's another part that can be interesting to explore, is the way information technologies can separate us from nature. Like, what can be the role of infotech in this gap that is created between our society and the natural world?
I mean, all technology separates us from nature. And as soon as you build a stone tool that allows you to process meat from a carcass that used to be impossible to process meat from, or to kill an animal that used to be impossible to kill, you have a fundamentally different relationship to that animal. And I think it would be that arc of technology being transmitted, and language and the alphabet being a very specific and important form of technology, that would be the same story as that kind of separation from nature. Separation from, even deeper than that, reality, because we're also separated from our own. And it's not like we're separated from the trees and sunsets and stuff, although that's true. We're separated from the idea that there is reality, and that's more fundamental. So, yeah, my sense is that the question of the presence of value in the biological world is perhaps the most important question we're facing now, which means, is nature worth preserving for its own sake? Or is that just like what stupid hippies say, right? Is human nature worth preserving for its own sake? Or is that just what like sappy religious people say? These questions are very deep, and they hinge upon the idea that there is something, there's structures in the universe that are non-arbitrary, that are not just having to do with physics and not just having to do with biology, but that have to do with this thing we've been talking about as cultural evolution, meaning value, meaning reflective human choice, guided by what? Guided by fiat, guided by selfishness, guided by ideology, or guided by actual learning in relation to reality. And so that disconnect from reality is technological, and I would say linguistic, then I'd say alphabetic, and then I'd start getting into media technologies and stuff, right? But it begins with the movement to speech. So there's very strong evidence, and this is McGilchrist, where I read this, that, and in other places as well, where we were burying our dead. We be meaning sapiens, not Homo sapiens, but bipedal, cerebrated sapiens. So like, Neanderthals, for example. Some of the evidence may have actually been found for this in France. But we were burying the dead before there's skeletal evidence that we had well articulated regions of the brain, like so that the cranial structures were too small for there to be enough hemispheric differentiation for there to be what we would call a language center. But the throat was big enough and complex enough for there to be total access to the full vocal cords, articulateness, which would make sense. So like in the jungle, we would have been able to imitate any creature. And then together we would have had this very complex, and it suggested that it was more like singing or chanting, which was non-semantically differentiated speech, which means it was not about anything. In those contexts, before we had propositionally differentiated speech, we were burying our dead ornamentally. You have to get that. So we were giving ritual burial to our dead before we were able to say anything about why. But we were coordinating our behaviors through chant and song. It's from that we boot propositionally differentiated speech, which emerges, let's say, quote, in the left hemisphere, right? Meaning is sourced from the world through the right hemisphere, through whatever it was that allowed us to recognize that the uniqueness of an individual human somehow needs to be regarded when they die, and that perhaps it's related to this broader thing, like their practices suggest religiosity, pre-linguistic religiosity, which you also see in little kids, but that's a different context. Language is very weird. Propositionally differentiated language is very weird. Even the difference. So that the first thing is that are you dealing with language that has a syntactical structure that allows for the isolation of individuals, actions, processes, or not? And then, of course, after language, the written word is even more intense. And there's a very deep conversation about the phonetic alphabets versus the ideographic alphabets, right? As altering psychology and sociology at the level of the base of the stack of the nervous system, which means it's you, if you have been trained primarily on an ideographical alphabet, your brain will be different from someone who works with the Phoenician alphabet. So writing. And then, as you're saying, printing press and into those things. So that's the story of increasing distance from reality. Now, it's not just that. And this is back to the like, why are we in the situation we are as a species? It was very, like, obviously in advance to those who created and propagated these means of communication. It's only that in retrospect, second and third order impacts, we can say, wow, that was a big thing. So we could say, wow, if only the alphabet hadn't been invented or something, like we never would have got the meta crisis, or if only we hadn't had that first stone tool or something like that. But now you're in these thought experiments that are so counterfactual as to be misleading. So it's clear that there were elements that became available through speech and through writing. And we see this with our own love of speech and writing, that or both separating from reality, but opening up new reality. So this gets weirdest with math. It's weirdest with math because, especially in formal math, you get really and I don't do a lot of math, but I talk to like mystical mathematicians who tell me basically how weird it is that our mathematical constructs, which really are the result of radical scaffolding through like complex symbol systems that are manipulated on paper and in computers and stuff, that stuff aligns with the deepest processes of how reality actually works. Because you're out of the realm of like, oh, I saw it do that 20 times and I know that it works that way. You're not in that realm of like, here's how reality works. You're so far away from anything empirical that it takes 20 years for some physics experiment to be able to catch up to even need math like that. And then all of a sudden that math directly is relevant. That's super crazy. So again, you're back to this notion that embedded within the human nervous system are billions of years of evolution, and in fact, billions of years of forms of knowing. So where is math? Right? And that's different from like, where is a chemical reaction? Oh, it's right there. I'm looking at it through a microscope. Right? Whereas math is similar to like, where is goodness? And this is where I'm going with value. Math has values, right? In terms of equations, values. And then you have this notion of value. So that basic question is math 2 + 2 is 4. Why? Not because of causality, not because of a material process. 2 + 2 is also not 4 because it's like my opinion, man, or just like what we think around here. So you can't have a relativistic answer. And then there's this deeper question about the comparability of that to questions of value, meaning basically, okay, then where is goodness? Right? Similar question. It's non-arbitrary, embedded in the universe, but not a physical process, not detectable by physical sciences and measurement. Right? You can't measure that 2 + 2 is 4. There's no like mathometer that measures that 2 + 2 is 4. You can totally measure that the chemical reaction has occurred, or that this thing is this heavy, or that the structure will stand. But you can't. See what I'm saying? So similarly with value, it's pretty deep. It's starting to rain here. I don't know if you can hear that.
No, I don't hear it actually.
Okay.
That's okay. Yeah, and you talk about math, so let's talk about science, because the scientific worldview that you talk about in your paper is prevalent in our society. It has some limitations, and in your paper you mention Plato, Kant, Alfred Whitehead's critique of scientific materialism. Can you talk more about the nature of the scientific worldview? Why this paradigm can be incomplete to think about our problems today?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say, when we say science, we have to be clear what we mean. It's not like some big science with a capital S. We're talking about a very specific set of practices and beliefs. So mostly what we're critiquing is not science, which emerged out of natural philosophy, which was a set of values and methods that were concerned with inquiry, basically. So the origin of science is in the coupling of mathematics and measurement to a non-dogmatic orientation to knowledge, meaning like it emerges out of religious ideology that doesn't want you to look through the telescope and actually count how many planets there are. But the telescope is a form of measurement, so we start to use measures, which are technological extensions of the reliable differential responsiveness of our own organism. And then we couple those quantitative things to math, and then we couple that to an experimental method, all in the interest of just knowing more and more and more. That's cool. I love that. That eventually emerged into what became known as technoscience, which was wedded to nation states and military apparatuses. So if you just do a realpolitik analysis of the evolution of science, it gets wedded to technological, economic, and weaponry interests very early. And so that means that science went from being something that was interested in exploring the universe to becoming something that was totally interested in exploring the universe insofar as it was also applicable to XYZ, meaning making money in medical technology or defense and weapons technology, and etc. Coupled to that dominance in the funding and academic apparatus, because science made those things well in many ways, there was the hegemony of a scientific worldview, which I would call scientism. So you can be a scientist knowing that you're doing very specific work in an area and be pretty agnostic about how the whole universe holds together, right? Because that's not your field, man. Like, you study math equations in plasma or something, right? You're not studying theology, you're not studying all the fields of science. But what happens is that in the absence of an actual like holistic religious worldview, which modernity disproved and discredited through all of its various sciences, there never recongealed a holistic cosmovision from the fractured and disconnected findings of all the special sciences, right? So one just showed up in our subconscious and started being the predominant default worldview, which is basically materialist, reductionist, determinist scientism, which says the only thing that's really real is matter. So totally there's biology and psychology and all that stuff, but we all know, wink, wink, that the realest of the real is matter, and therefore that the truest of the true is the results of physics. And that if we did it right, we would reduce the laws of psychology to biology and the laws of biology to physics. And then that would mean that because physics is deterministic, that the world is deterministic. So therefore, our received understanding of ourselves is completely incorrect. And there's some other view of us which removes our freedom of will, which removes the possibility that our moral self-understandings are real from the perspective of science, and leaves us with the idea that the universe is arbitrary and we're kind of evolved meat machines that are causally determined. And now no one's explicitly saying it that way, although some people do, not the everyday people. But I would argue that this is one of the default assumptions of the everyday people, right? That the onus in conversations I've had about value, the onus has been on me to make the argument that value is intrinsic to the universe, because the default assumption is that value is relative and only a human social construction. And so that's very different from the pre-modern world or even early modernity, where the assumption was much more that the universe was meaningful. Of course, the universe was meaningful. There was a small number of crazy scientists talking us out of that idea and making us think it was meaningless. And now we're in the opposite situation where people want to believe mystical stuff, but they can't quite believe it. They want to believe that the world is full of meaning, that their choices matter, but they have to like talk themselves into it and like have a physicist tell them that quantum mechanics, allows for it or something. And that's odd. And we actually listen to physicists as if they're priests and wise men, when they're absolutely not. And we ignore the actually wise people because we think they don't know science. And so somehow science stepped in to be, and scientists specifically, the only ones who are allowed to say true things. But a lot of what I've been saying lately is that actually everyone has the ability to say things that are true. And that's like almost weird to say, like, whoa, but school teaches us that actually we have to double check everything, and that there's this really complex realm where only experts can kind of weigh in. But in fact, the domain of truth, as I was saying, in your everyday experience is infinite information. In your given experience without scientific training, there's inexhaustible truth present to you now. Where science would say, no, the truth, we don't know. The truth is in the future, right? And you certainly don't know. You need a dozen years of training across all these fields, and even then, you're it's in the future, and correct. And there's an infinite amount of truth available to me right now. A lot of it I can say, a lot of it I can't say, but a lot of it I can say. And those are the truths of the self-disclosing living value that is present in all of our experience. And that means it's the truths of the universe disclosing to us what it is and what it values. So like, for example, if you're sitting there and you get hungry, that is true. You are hungry. You know you are hungry. And what is that? That is not you. You're not like doing calculations saying I'm hungry. You don't control your metabolism. That's a multi-billion year evolutionary process that produced your incredibly complex digestive system, bringing to your awareness that it's hungry. That's the universe being hungry. That's the clarification of desire reveals value. That your body's saying you should live, which is an intrinsic valuing of life, which is one of the basic things that the scientists smuggle in, like natural selection. It's like, oh yeah, but yeah, why are we doing that? Because we want to live and propagate. Okay, but that seems to be a pretty fundamental value, right? So similarly, hunger is present to you as a sign of something that's actually real, that's actually valuable. So it's very simple and almost too simple, but it's just pointing out that your body, without your interfering through your conscious attention, your body is regulating itself. It is metabolizing food. It is beating your heart. It is breathing. And it is disclosing to you what is good and what should be avoided at all kinds of levels. And so, tremendous amount of information. None of that is brought to your attention in school, right? They teach you to be outwardly focused and to think that the sources of knowledge are out there. Books, you get knowledge from the outside. And you do, absolutely. I'm not saying one is bad. I'm just emphasizing this one because I'm holding this polarity. But there's also, again, as the meditative traditions show us, as the lineages and the perennial wisdom traditions show us, the interiority is vast. And again, where is 2 + 2? Right? Where is the righteousness that validates sacrifice and gives moral rectitude? Like, where is that? How do we know that we need to stand for something? When do we stand for something? Where's the energy for that? So again, this is me rambling a little bit, but it's a deep question.
Yeah, and now that we talked about the kind of immature idea of progress, what would be a more mature idea of progress? How do we factor all the things that we said?
Yeah, so in the paper there are some suggestions, like, so for example, if our definition is held that immature progress is kind of like narrow metric optimization progress, meaning like you just focus on this one little thing, and if you succeed at that, you think you have succeeded, and who cares about the rest? So one thing you want to do is think about the what we call yellow teaming. I'm not going to get into all that, but it basically means, are you really thinking through the second and third order effects of the success of your action? So most people think about, how can I be successful? That would be called like red teaming. I'm going to try to break it so that I can make it really work, so that when I release it into the world, no one can break it and it just works. So we're like, great, but what happens, what goes wrong from it working? Because again, the naive progress model isn't that there's no progress. It's that, yeah, that has been progress, but it caused absence of progress over there. Right? So what we're saying is, okay, that if that's truly progressive, then it should raise all the boats, right? Like if it's truly progressive, then the second and third order effects would be net beneficial to everything it touches, rather than the second and third order effects being massively detrimental to hugely important things, which is what a lot of our technologies do now. They give us actually minimal benefit relative to the type of second and third order externality. So that's one bit. Just holistically factor the conditions for the success of your choice. And this is wisdom, right? Like, mature progress is wisdom. Wisdom is the binding of power through something that is not power. Right? How are the claws of the tiger bound? Right? By the entire selection of the ecosystem. And so similarly, there needs to be, in our thoughts about the futures for civilization, notions of holistic selection for all innovation, which is not capitalism or communism. It's not a centralized market economy, but it's also not just a distributed do anything you want economy. And if there were responsibilities, very specifically and well articulated responsibilities for these types of processes to be undertaken, meaning any technology that's going to roll out needs to have demonstrated its safety, not in some simplistic sense, but in a truly holistic sense, which means that we would never have gotten the social media that we have. Right? We just wouldn't, because if you really look at what it's going to do, it has been obviously so bad that it has overwhelmingly been worse than the benefit that it was invented to provide. And if it had actually been invented to provide that benefit, instead of tell people it was providing that benefit while doing something else, that would have been a different story. So that's, I think, some of that. We need to guide technology development specifically with wisdom, and therefore not use technology to solve and bind other technologies, which is what we do now. We create rackets. Like, this technology creates that problem, another technology solves that problem. We all make money. And then that system creates another problem, and then another technology comes in to solve the higher order problem, and then that thing makes money. So there's a racket set up where we know that it'll probably cause problems, but we'll just solve those problems with other technology. That's not wisdom. That's stupid. Wisdom binds technology with something that's not technology, meaning the human capacity, as I've been talking about, to leverage billions of years of evolved intelligence that's present in the nervous system, to make decisions that machines and technologies cannot make. So yeah, mature progress is very complex and deliberate. And a lot of mature progress also involves activities of maintenance and preservation. So the other thing that's naive about our progress is that it's just all about destruction and creation and movement forward. And it's nothing about sustaining and preserving what has already been and that has obviously succeeded. And so that would be another factor. A lot of attention, and actually a lot of technologies, would be technologies of preservation and regeneration rather than technologies of destruction and creation. And so that is another thing that maturity gives with progress, is that progress comes in time and with seasons and not exponentially, and a few other factors which would have to be also leveraged. So, most of the work that we're thinking about in the coming year or two is in this direction. It's meta-crisis diagnosis is clear enough. Naive progress is obvious enough. But what are the decision procedures, technologies, and other things that actually get us going in the direction of wisdom? So yeah, these are the questions for the coming years, and they're crucial.
Yeah, and maybe we can take an example of technology that has so much negative effects. You talked about social media. One of the advantage of this is that if you make a healthy social media, you can have you can reverse all of those negative effects and have positive effects. What would look like a healthy social media in your opinion?
I mean, there's a lot. We don't quite have enough time here, but what I'll say is a couple quick things. One is that the stated purpose of the technology to its consumers should be the same as its stated purpose to its investors. So Facebook, just to take an example, Facebook is an advertising company, which means that when people invest in it, and the people who actually give it money are people who are told that it is a technology to manipulate people's behavior. That's what advertising is. So if you're an advertising tech company, it means you have some powerful tech to manipulate behavior. Otherwise, if I'm an advertiser, why would I give you money? So that's the story they tell their money making. But then they ostensibly give it away to free to their customers, telling them completely something else. They don't tell them that this is something that's been built to systematically manipulate their nervous system to get them to do things, which is what they tell the people who give them money. The people that they give it away to for free are told that it's to connect them and to help them be creative and to be a platform for expression, and maybe they can make some money on it and stuff like that, right? So to me right there, like, nope, like that's not even about the technology. That's about the business and the willingness of our most powerful tech companies to be deceptive very fundamentally in their relationship to the mass number of users. So right there, if you just have a simple thing, oh, you have to tell the truth about the product that you are offering and actually make it visible to the users what is actually occurring with the manipulation of their data. So again, this just seems like the Better Business Bureau, or just like this is simple stuff. But in fact, it shows how far we are in the situation of being able to do this before you even get into like, what would the algorithm look like? And how would you actually measure that people are getting smarter rather than more polarized? And so there's a whole bunch of technical questions about the design of the technology. I think those are actually trivial compared to this question I'm raising here, which is the monetization / business model / totally accepted for some reason lying and deception about one of the most powerful ubiquitous technologies. OpenAI similarly makes a chatbot that uses first-person pronouns and that people talk to as if it's a person. Openly deceptive, design decision. One of the most powerful technologies in history is designed to do what? Trick you into thinking that it's a language-using creature. Facebook, one of the most powerful technologies, trick you into thinking it's not a behavior manipulating thing. So right there, it's just boom, design, good faith technology. Basically design technology that is what it claims to be, that is not fundamentally built on deception of user base, and that is also not fundamentally built to maximize profit. If you can't do any of those things, then we can't even talk about the technical problems, basically. And if you have a technical problem and you roll it out, it will get eaten by that thing because that thing has making so much money. And apparently it's completely acceptable to lie and, basically abuse kids is how I see it. Yeah, so that's my sense. It's hard to talk about like some visionary future for social media where it's like, no, like the brass tacks of it is these guys are willing to lie and they're willing to put profit over the health of entire generations.
Well, Zach, thank you very much.
Yeah, likewise. And have a good rest of your day. And I look forward to talking again at some point.